Hello, for those who don't know me, my name is Kelly Frieda and I am the chair of the Mass Envirothon Steering Committee. The Envirothon is Massachusetts' leading natural resource education program for high school students, emphasizing hands-on, team-oriented problem solving and community involvement that prepares young people for environmental careers and active citizenship. We're glad to have you here this afternoon so we can keep learning together. I'm happy to get to introduce our presenter today, Matt Marro, conservation agent for the town of Sterling. Matt was also my mentor when I interned with him when I was in college 25 years ago. Matt has been working in the environmental and wetlands field for 33 years and is knowledgeable of all things water. So I really encourage you to ask him any questions that you might have using the question and answer button on the bottom of the screen. On behalf of the Mass Envirothon Steering Committee, I would like to thank Matt for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us today. And I would also like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Envirothon website at massenvirothon.org. Thank you and welcome, Matt.
Well, thank you, Kelly. That was a very nice introduction. Very humbling, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen, and you see that okay?
Perfect.
So, wetlands in Massachusetts. As Kelly told you, I am a conservation agent for the town of Sterling. I've actually been a conservation agent concurrently in a few other towns, and I've been a conservation agent for the past, actually, Kelly, can you believe it's been almost 34 years? Hence all the ball and the gray, but it's been worth every hair loss, every gray hair, every scar. It's a lot of fun doing this line of work. It's very intense. I know, people tend to think of wetlands, they think of either useless pieces of land or swamps or movies with alligators in it, but wetlands are a lot more, especially in Massachusetts. You'd be surprised at how close they are to your own backyard and where you've seen them. So we'll get started with a little slideshow that I've made here. And Kelly, if there's any questions you want that you feel will help flesh out this presentation, please feel free to shoot them to me, okay?
Great.
Just yell them right out. So, wetlands. Wetlands actually have a lot of different functions biologically and to society as a whole. So this a lot of the pictures I actually clipped off different websites that I've actually taken my own education materials from. So I figured I'd share all these with you. So wetlands contribute to a lot of different public interests. You can see here basics in this diagram. So you see, if you follow the cursor that I've got right here, right now circling, where it says dissipate stream energy. Well, you have a lot of streams that go downhill, they meander, they have stream beds with rocks. Actually, that will help to enter into the wetland and actually dissipate all of that velocity coming into the offlow and heading off into larger stream systems or into the ocean. So what happens is you have a lot of runoff that heads into wetlands, and wetlands actually wind up holding a lot of water. And when they hold all that water, when you have heavy rainfalls, you can see right here where I'm circling. What it means by contaminant and sediments is that you have things like salt and sand from the road, fertilizer runoff, silt, road sand, all of that is actually filtered out into a wetland, and it helps to preserve water quality that way. You have underneath actually a wetland, you can see where it says saturated peat storing water. Well, it's also known as hydric soil. Hydric soil basically has bacteria in it that are anaerobic, meaning they don't need oxygen. They tend to break down all these contaminants. They tend to filter out groundwater, the groundwater flow. And it's another biological way of keeping water clean by filtering it out. So what happens is the water heads into the peat. Peat saturates, the natural biological processes take over, and it winds up slowly releasing it again into either a major stream, river, or the ocean. So what you wind up with is dirtier water coming in on one side and cleaner water going out. But there's also a lot of other things that wetlands wind up doing. They wind up controlling the flooding because, as I pointed out earlier, everything ponds in here holds the water back, keeps it from flooding out other properties that are downstream of it. It also provides critical wildlife habitat because you have a lot of like waterfowl, fish, shoreline habitat, mammals that use it as a water source or a food source or both. And it also provides for like stormwater temperature control. So water that's coming off, say like a developed area that's hotter, will actually use a wetland system to cool off. And everything winds up flowing into either large rivers or streams. So it prevents pollution. It protects water supply, because a lot of these wetlands here that I'm circling flow into public water supplies. Also, a lot of people get their water from underground where it has groundwater flow. If you're getting your water from the ground, these wetlands help to keep that water clean. So it protects groundwater. It prevents pollution. It makes a wildlife habitat. Next slide. What are the importance of wetlands? I touched on that earlier in the previous slide. They're highly productive. You get a lot of sunlight, you get a lot more increase in plants and animals. It makes a good nesting and breeding ground for migratory birds. So ducks are the biggest example, ducks, geese. Those are your most common migratory birds in ponds. It slows flooding by absorbing runoff. And I believe I went into that when I spoke about dissipating energy coming from the stream here. Silt, the dirt I had spoken about, settles into the pond, making the water clearer and more nutrient rich. It traps, the wetlands itself trap and filter the water. Natural chemical reactions, that's what the RXN is, abbreviation for reactions, neutralizes and detoxifies pollutants. It gives time for the water to percolate through the soil and replenish underground aquifers. You probably recall I had spoken earlier about getting your water from an underground well instead of from a town water source. Threats to wetlands are what's known as artificial eutrophication. Now, I don't have a slide 13. That just came from the article I cribbed it from, so you can disregard that. Artificial eutrophication, draining and sedimentation via construction. When I say those words, artificial eutrophication, draining, sedimentation via construction, if you want to think about what that is, it's very fancy terminology for what I like to call human habitation, human wreckage. So what winds up happening is, as man goes into a wildlife habitat, we do things like put in roads, and roadways can be the most environmentally intrusive of all of the development that humans do. The reason why I say that is because when you have impervious pavement, water speeds up when it runs downhill on impervious pavement, picks up a lot of dirt, picks up a lot of material coming off of lawns like fertilizer. It winds up heading into storm drains, and a lot of the old style storm drains that just went like the different books of streams with no types of treatment. So you wind up getting really big chunks of warm water and heavy loads of nutrients from the fertilizers going into these ponds. So what winds up happening? Well, what winds up happening is these ponds start to, the term is eutrophication. A common term is called stagnation. So the pond essentially starts turning stagnant, meaning it gets an artificial shot of heavy nutrients, you wind up having out of control growth. It winds up losing its oxygen levels, and the biodiversity, the different forms of life, wind up suffering as a result. You can see a lot with artificial eutrophication around like large ponds that people live around. For example, like Leominster has Lake Samoset, where people live closely around that lake. Leominster and Lunenburg share Lake Whalum. Lunenburg has Lake Shirley and Hickory Hills Lake. Westminster has Wyman's Pond. Because of the amount of roads that are now around those bodies of water and the houses and the lawns with heavy duty fertilizers, it speeds up the process of those ponds basically eutrophying or stagnating from hundreds of years, which is the natural life cycle of a pond. A pond will come, survive for centuries, eventually not stagnate, but it'll eventually turn to like a filled-in swamp. And then it turns into hardland and wetlands form somewhere else. But that takes a process of centuries. But with dense settlement around lakes and ponds for recreational purposes, we've accelerated what normally would take hundreds of years for eutrophication, as it says on the slide, to decades. That's why you see a lot of ponds doing chemical treatments. They do drawdowns. They do dredging around the sides. They do that because of what's on this slide that says artificial eutrophication. That's the consequence of that. And those of you that live around lakes, or you have friends that live around lakes and you've seen them drain, you've seen them draw down, you've seen the chemical treatment trucks going in and spreading out like different chemicals to keep the water clean. It's a result of building around it. So that's what happens with the lakes. But you've probably heard about a lot of older developments that wind up having water problems in their basements because they were quote unquote built in old swamps. Well, the next line on that, the next word where it says, see slide 13 on your slide here that I have up, where it says draining. Years ago, it was not uncommon to consider wetlands as a useless piece of land and to make it usable, they drained it. They drained out the water off of it, they dried it out, and they put structures on top of it. In some cases, cities. But what winds up happening is because even though they've drained the water away, the soil still had properties to be able to store water. So if you don't have proper drainage, and now what winds up happening is you wind up getting a flooded basement. Well, then what do you got to do? You've got to build another artificial drainage to drain it off. So as you can see by what I'm saying, there winds up being a chain reaction from human habitation. So sedimentation via construction is another result of that, human habitation. I'm sure all of you, especially those that drive, when you drive around and you see areas where, say, they're building a house or they're building a new building or they're changing a storefront around, it's raining heavy and you see coffee-colored runoff coming off the site because it's got sediment going into it. Well, that sediment isn't really good to be running off. It makes its way into the drainage system and makes its way into the wetlands. And sediment, again, is full of these nutrients that wind up making their way into the lakes and the ponds and the streams in this area. And that causes the chain reaction that brings us right back to artificial eutrophication. So you can see why on the bottom, they call wetlands nature's septic tank. Because wetlands actually do a lot of work to keep water clean. The problem with human habitation is for years we didn't watch what we were doing around them. And as a result, we overloaded them, which is why we now have the process I described earlier about draining lakes and having to do chemical treatment and dredging and all of that. Different types of wetlands that are actually out there. I'm going to be dealing with mostly inland. Yeah, I'm going to be dealing with inland wetlands. I'm not going to be dealing with anything on the ocean. But while I've got your attention, I need to point out the obvious that a lot of people miss. The ocean is a big, gigantic wetland. It is protected as a wetland under state and federal law now. It has the same properties as the wetlands that are inland. It's just done in a different manner. There are different benefits to the ocean. A lot of them are very obvious. A lot of them are not so obvious. But without our oceans, there would be no us. So protecting the oceans has become a very big deal. So a lot of wetlands laws are geared towards coastal wetlands. But in this part of the state, our work on protection deals with inland wetlands, because when you protect inland wetlands, you wind up protecting the ocean as well, because that's where everything winds up flowing off to eventually. I also wanted to point out the obvious, that a big lake or a pond is also another wetland. I have a lot of people that when I say wetland, they think about a swamp or a bog or a marsh. I'm going to show you some pretty pictures of those, but people seem to forget a lake is a wetland. I've often come on people doing some really weird things in a lake that they're not supposed to be, as far as filling and working in or putting in sand. And I say, you really can't do that. That's a protectable wetland. And they say, no, it's not, it's a lake. Funny how the concept is missed. So I wanted to point that out to you guys. Always remember the obvious. A lake or a pond is a wetland. Let's bring us to the first type of wetland that's common around here. Here is a very large marsh. You see these off of highways. You see these off of town, even in town commons. For example, Lunenburg Town Common. If you go in Lunenburg Town Common and you go behind Town Hall, where Main Street Bank is, what's in between Main Street Bank and Chestnut Street, heading to the baseball field on the opposite side, is a very large marsh. And that marsh is full of a lot of wildlife, which marshes like these are very commonly filled with wildlife. A lot of it is obviously, you can see, you know, waterfowl, for example, ducks being the most common. Sometimes you'll see loons, sometimes you'll see great blue herring, which are very big birds with very, very big and beautiful wingspans. But there's also a lot of life that's not very obvious in here. Fish, snakes. Actually, there's a marsh in Pittsburgh over by Marshall Park, which has actually crayfish in it that come out from a year-round stream that's right nearby. So you'd be surprised at the types of wildlife you can find. Next, we have a freshwater swamp. This particular freshwater swamp actually is in the state of Louisiana. I clipped this picture because it is actually a beautiful example of a freshwater swamp. And we do have similar swamps around here in this part of the state. I just didn't have as nice of an aerial to show everybody as I do like this one. Now this one, obviously, the biodiversity in here is pretty apparent. Different types of birds, fish, reptiles, insects, you name it, it would be in a big marsh like this. The marsh has a unique property of being able to do a lot of water filtering. And it soaks up a lot of these nutrients that we had discussed earlier. I think if you look at the bottom of the picture where I'm going to circle my cursor, sorry about the right click, you can see people in the boat. You can see how the water has a bit of a tinge, a bit of a yellowish tinge on it. That's actually normal. This is a very shallow particular marsh, so the bottom is actually readily visible, meaning the water is actually very clear. And this water winds up eventually discharging to the ocean, because the ocean is actually very nearby. And this large forested freshwater swamp is like the last line of defense for urban runoff coming off and being cleaned out before it gets into the ocean. If we didn't have these large water bodies, the garbage that we wind up inadvertently putting into our water systems through our storm drains would wind up going straight into the ocean. And that would cause problems that we don't have enough time to go into today. But you can feel free to email me to ask me about it. And by the way, I'm willing to Zoom meet with anybody that wants to go into this stuff further. Again, all you have to do is email me and we can set up some time. Here's a cool one in the state of Utah. You can see behind it the desert. Right in the middle of the desert is this little wetland oasis. People often think of oasis as something with a palm tree with a well with crystal clear water in it that you see in a movie. This particular little oasis is a little marsh area. It is a kettle hole that has soils that will store a lot of water. It will do a lot of water filtering. It's an isolated area. It's a nice spot for wildlife in the middle of a desert. And what's the value on this if it doesn't go to the ocean? Well, out in that part of the country in the West, most of your water supply out in the West and the Midwest is groundwater. It's done by aquifer. Aquifer recharge is a critical issue out in the West and the Midwest. Keeping and preserving these wetlands help preserve that water that is trickling into the ground, and it helps to preserve the quality. It helps to keep it clean. These wetlands here are pretty critical and pretty valuable out in that part of the country. And I wanted you to see that they actually exist and they actually have a function. Here's your classic peat bog. This is a big one. I got this picture as a good example because it is a big one. Peat bogs are areas that hold a very unique type of soil, which we call peat. Now, there are areas in other parts of the world where peat is mined, and you can buy it retail in a nursery. And if you've ever bought a bag of peat, it has a very unique texture to it. Peat in an actual peat bog has absolutely zero foreign oxygen content. It's very acidic. And as a result of the nature of peat, things that sink in a peat bog wind up actually getting preserved quite readily. That's where you find a lot of your intact fossils. And in the magazines that you've read, you may have seen pictures of a mummified man that was maybe like 3,000 or 4,000 years old and looked like he had just passed away. And they would call him the peat bog man. Well, where do you think they found him? In one of these. Peat bogs are very valuable for the same reason the other wetlands are. You can see a peat bog holds a lot of water. And because it can hold a lot of water, it winds up affecting and impacting the soils in such a way that creates the peat under the peat bog. Again, this is very valuable for a very diverse wildlife inventory in here. And I think just the picture speaks for itself. Plants commonly found around here in wetlands. Now, you've seen them all, I guarantee it. The plants I show you are very common. And rare species, I'm sure that you've probably seen rare species. You probably just don't know you've seen them. There are a lot of different protected plants and animals in the Commonwealth, from the lady slipper to the Blanding's turtle. Lady slipper is a plant, Blanding's turtle is a reptile. There are protected grasses, there are protected plants, there are protected animals, there are protected birds. The state has a fair share of its content of rare species. So, very common in this area is a plant, a ground-based plant called a cinnamon fern. Circling it with my cursor right now. The cinnamon fern is, you can see the stalk in the middle, and the cinnamon fern basically gathers around it the fronds here in a bunch of 5. If you actually walked up and kind of touched one of these fronds and lifted it and looked in the back, you'd see a lot of what looks like brown fuzzy material. Some of my professors like to call it a brown hairy back. That's a telltale sign of cinnamon fern. There are a lot of different varieties of fern that you will find in wetlands in this part of the state of Massachusetts. Cinnamon fern actually happens to be the most common one you will find because it grows very quickly and it grows in abundance. Common cattail. A lot of your ponds around here on the edges, you will see common cattail. Cattail is actually very good for ducks and other waterfowl because, number one, the soft tissue in the plant in the center provides a food source, and number two, it is a good waterfowl shelter. Cattail also is considered an invasive to a degree. You'll have areas where cattail will take over that have been impacted by human habitation. There's that little phrase again, human habitation, where the cattail wind up forming what's called a monoculture. And it means exactly what it sounds. When we think about people in the United States, we think about a culture with a variety of peoples and customs and nationalities in it. The United States only had one type of person with one type of nationality, and they all did the same thing. That would be pretty monotonous, hence the term monoculture. So what you don't want is you don't want a situation where you wind up getting a monoculture of a plant, cattail being one of them. And cattails are very, very prolific at becoming a monoculture in a spot where humans have intervened with development. It's kind of a mixed bag because, again, it is very good for waterfowl, but it winds up choking out other varieties of plants that you would need as food sources for other animals, and they also have different filtering options. Next, I want to go into the legendary term vernal pools. We've all heard this term now. Vernal pools is something that a lot of us learn about in school now at a young age. Vernal pools are also called inferral pools. The reason why they're known as inferral is because they basically last in the spring only. In order to be a viable vernal pool where you wind up actually maintaining species, that little body of water, that little isolated puddle, has to be 4 inches deep at a minimum. You can find vernal pools in different areas around undeveloped lands, and there's no real inlet or outlet to it. And the thing about vernal pools that makes them vernal pools is certain species will breed in these because they wind up not being subject to predators like fish or other reptiles. And it makes reproduction, it makes their ability to continue their line a breeze. That's the reason why vernal pools are so valuable. It is a breeding ground. And some of the animals that breed in there are a little bit rarer than others, and some of them are very common. Vernal pool comes out when spring has sprung. You can see here an example of a vernal pool. I've actually got a better example here. This is your classic vernal pool in central Massachusetts. This actually looks like one I actually discovered in Shirley last year. When you look for a vernal pool, you can see not only the telltale fact that it's got water that's held in the spring, but you can see, like, from falling branches that are in here around it. You can see the leaf litter around it. Leaf litter makes its way into the pool. You can see this pool here, the water is starting to dry out. So it's probably a little bit, either a little bit of a warm spring or a little bit later in the spring when this picture was taken. So what you've got here is, for example, you've got these branches from a tree that are hanging in the pool. Well, you've got a lot of like reptiles, like salamanders and frogs that will use these branches in the water to put their egg masses on. So if you actually gently waded into a vernal pool and lifted one of these up, odds are you would find egg masses attached to them. They like to attach their egg masses to branches, to, just larger sticks like this. But vernal pool species can also exist in a big pool like this one. I just want you to note that this is in a very large meadow. So it does get a lot of sunlight, but it also holds a larger volume of water so that the same species can wind up breeding in this as well. There's no inlet to it, there's no outlet, there's no fish population. So their risk of being preyed on by a higher life form is actually non-existent. Again, which makes the vernal pool valuable. Meet salamander and Sal's babies. Salamander is one of the most common species you will find in the vernal pool. So this particular yellow spotted salamander and the salamander eggs have a greenish color to it. Salamander eggs will wind up having either a greenish color or a clear color. You'll see an egg sac that looks just like this. I would advise, I've picked them up, but I would advise you just to leave them alone. The only reason why I've even handled an egg sac is because I was evaluating whether or not a vernal pool exists. So when I picked up a branch, I found the sac, but I put it right back. You can see why this is a very valuable breeding habitat for salamanders, because these eggs are very fragile, they're very susceptible, and fish would love them. So, wood frogs. I'm sure anybody that spent a lot of time out in the woods have seen a lot of wood frogs. And wood frogs breed specifically in vernal pools. They are a species that is a classic telltale sign of having a vernal pool. Frogs love waters like that to breed in. One particular, well, we'll get to that one later. We also have fairy shrimp, which is part of the pool. But most importantly, we have spring peepers. Spring peepers is another type of frog species that goes in a vernal pool. And one thing I've noticed about peepers in central Massachusetts, as I'm sure there are a lot of other vernal pools in other parts of the state, is they breed in very large numbers. You can hear them in the springtime at night. They get very, very loud. A lot of times I will know where to look for a vernal pool because I usually wait for the peepers to start their cry right around dusk, or when the sun goes over to one side and the shadow takes over. For example, I found a vernal pool in Leominster behind the Target Plaza, and the peepers will start going off around like 2:30 in the afternoon. You'll start hearing them, and they'll be very loud, and they'll be very numerous. And that's how I actually found the pool that was there, because you can't miss but hearing them. I'm sure all of you have heard peepers, especially if you hang out in the rural sections of Leominster, Sterling, Templeton, Gardner, Westminster. You'll hear them in force in the springtime. I wish actually I was able to get a recording of one to be able to play on this, but I wasn't able to find something that I could share with you. Rare species. Rare species is something you find commonly in wetlands because they breed and overwinter in wetlands. The law protects all forms of life found in the wild. When I said all forms of life, I mean all forms of life. Rare species that are protected range from grasses to insects to plants. There are beetles. There are different types of grasses that are protected. There are different types of turtles that are protected. There are different types of salamanders that are protected, birds, flowering plants. Turtles seem to be the one that are most noted. People seem to really like turtles. Maybe it's because turtles are the most obvious and the most visible other than lady slippers. Any development in a rare species habitat is regulated through the state's Natural Heritage Program. That is part of the Mass Endangered Species Bureau that works for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You want to do anything in a habitat area that's marked, you've got to go through that program and get permission, and they're very strict with the conditions because they have to protect those species. One of the species that is very, I hear noted a lot, is the Blanding's turtle. Every time someone finds a Blanding's turtle, it causes a big stir of excitement. Blanding's turtles are very fragile, so you have to protect their habitat a great deal. Blanding's turtles love to overwinter and hang out in marshy areas. If you find a Blanding's turtle, I would urge you to take a photograph of it. I would urge you to report it to the state or report it to your local conservation agent who can file a report with the state. These turtles are very threatened. They're very beautiful, but they're very fragile. You can tell a Blanding's turtle by the telltale yellow chin. You see that bright gold chin. The underbody of it is pretty similar in color. It's very unmistakable. Now, want to touch a little bit on reclaiming wetlands. And I spoke earlier about what I call human habitation, human intervention. Well, when people build things, they touched wetlands, they drained wetlands, they filled wetlands, they crossed wetlands, and they did it without thinking of the consequences. Well, now we realize what those consequences are. So whenever we have to touch any type of wetland, we have to account for it. So we have to reclaim these wetlands. The technical term when you reclaim a wetland is called a replication. So replication is a term that is used when, under the law, if you fill up to 5,000 square feet of wetlands with something you're developing on a piece of property, which is the maximum the law will allow, you have to replace the wetlands on that same piece of property at a 1-to-1 ratio. When I say 1-to-1, I mean square foot per square foot. So if you own a piece of property and it's unavoidable that you have to fill, say, 2,000 square feet of wetlands to cross it with a driveway in order to access the rest of the property, you have to take that 2,500 square feet and replace 2,500 square feet right on the same wetland system on the same property. The replacement is called replication. Doing a successful replication requires a lot of monitoring and a lot of elbow grease. It can be very successful if it's done right. Which leads us to our next phase of my little talk here, how to recreate a wetland. As I stated earlier, filled wetlands must be reclaimed on the same site, and the law allows up to 5,000 square feet. So what you're seeing a picture of here is you're seeing a picture of a site where wetlands were filled. And I'm going to run my cursor. Kelly, can you see my cursor okay?
Yep, fine.
Okay, just wanted to make sure you're awake, actually. So what you've got here is this area where you see these brown soils is where the wetland is being reproduced. So this shape of the wetland abuts this part of the wetland system here. This is a very large wetland system. So what they did was they took an area that wasn't part of the wetland. They cut the elevation down to match the elevation of the wetland. So as you can see, water could come in. They did some starter plantings and they planted seeds along the bottom. What they did was when they filled the wetland, they took the wetland soils out of the area that they filled and they brought it over here because wetlands require a certain type of soil, the dark, peaty, boggy, really dark, rich soils that hold a lot of water in order to be able to grow properly. So that's why the soil here is dark. Here's that same area after it's grown in. When it's done right, it can come out pretty cool. You can see this line of silt fence actually goes around both sides to isolate the replicated wetland or the reclaimed wetland. And then you're abutting the wetland here that it was up against. And you can see that the plants that they planted in grew in thick, they're growing in good variety, and they were very successful. So what's happened here is we've taken the wetland that was filled and we basically replanted it in an area next to the remaining wetland where it will actually provide the same value and function. Pretty cool. Invasive plants, replication areas in other areas where human habitation has taken place can make it vulnerable to invasive plants. Now, some invasive plants are very pretty to look at, but they're very dangerous. Some invasive plants, like vines especially, can make a tree look pretty ugly. For example, a bittersweet vine is a vine that you'll see wrapped densely around large trees. You can see them along sides of roadways right now. It's a vine with a lot of berries off of them, and they will eventually choke the tree out. And thing about bittersweet vine is that you cut it, it just keeps coming back. Invasive plants can cause a lot of problems. First major problem is they can cause a monoculture, and I had gone into what a monoculture is. Two, they can cause premature plant mortality of the plants that they are invading. For example, the example I just gave you of the bittersweet going around the tree and killing the tree is one example. Common cattails growing in a pond that's getting basically silted up from runoff from an abutting development. That'll start taking over a ponded area, and all the other water plants that are there will start being choked out because the cattail just has a good optimal condition for growth, and it just starts taking everything over. So you wind up getting the plant mortality and the monoculture, a double bang for your buck. Invasive purple loosestrife. This is an example of an invasive plant that I said was pretty to look at. You look at purple loosestrife, it's beautiful. When it's in full bloom and it's in vivid color, it's a nice purple color. Purple happening to be one of my favorite colors. It is beautiful to look at. But it is one of those plants, like cattails, that will choke everything else out if left unchecked and will establish that monoculture. So you will eventually see areas where you start to see this plant growing in small patches. Then all of a sudden, a couple of years later, you'll go by and you'll say, oh, wow, this thing is a whole field of purple now. Because that's what it's done. It's now marched in. It's aggressively taken out other plants that it outcompeted for room. The thing about purple loosestrife is that each of those pretty purple stalks holds a couple of million seed pods at a time. So when that thing is in seed, the second you walk up and touch it, you've already spread the seeds around. So you have to be real careful and time the removal of this plant just right. Many people will treat this plant by chemical treatment. Many people will wait till it's in a phase where it's not seeding, basically do what's called bagging, meaning they will cover it with a bag, tie the bottom of the bag, and then dig it up by its roots, because the root is what you've got to get rid of. The state did a project back about 10 years ago where they released a special type of beetle that was bred that just ate purple loosestrife. Because back in the, I have to say, the late 90s, early 2000s, purple loosestrife was a real problem in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was vastly, very fast becoming a vast blanket of purple. This beetle that was bred to eat purple loosestrife did its job. Purple loosestrife went down. But I don't know, I'm going to ask Kelly. Kelly, have you noticed purple loosestrife starting to make a comeback last couple of years?
I have, especially along the sides of the highways.
Not only has Kelly verified that for me, folks, but Kelly's also verified the fact that she's still awake. Well, let's face it, come on, I can put people to sleep talking on like this. But purple loosestrife, I'm thinking, and Kelly, you probably agree with me, it's probably getting close to maybe doing another beetle release. Because of course, if purple loosestrife is the only food source that this beetle has, which is what it was bred for, purple loosestrife basically dies off for the most part. The beetles die off. Any purple loosestrife that's left starts reproducing, comes back, will make a cycle. Next slide. Again, common cattails, good duck habitat, but can party crash on a pond. That's the one thing you want to avoid. And I believe I went into that with you earlier, so I won't rebore you with the details. Lily pads, here's another one we didn't touch on. Think about it. How many of you have gone by ponds that are covered in these lily pads? Lily pads, when they start taking over a pond, it's a sure sign that the pond's undergoing eutrophication. It's a sure sign that there's a high nutrient content, because these lily pads in deeper ponds will take right over. I remember seeing a pond in Dudley that they have some pretty cute names for ponds in Dudley, Massachusetts. This particular pond was called Mosquito Pond. If you look at it in the spring, it's a nice looking, serene looking pond. But once the runoff hits it, the dry weather hits it, and the effects of those nutrients start to come out, it's covered in lily pads. And it looks like a giant mat of lily pads. Not very pleasurable to go boating in. Not very pleasurable for the biology of the pond, especially when it's covering the bottom and shading off the bottom of the emergent zone, where the water starts meeting the shoreline, where plants can grow, and it starts blocking off the sunlight. Lily pads, as pretty as they look or as gross as they can look, if they're totally covering the pond, can be a major problem. Another example of a monoculture you don't want to see. Building a wetland on purpose. In some countries, they build a wetland actually next to a development on purpose. They use it for stormwater control. So when you have heavy rainstorms and a lot of this water comes speeding off a roadway, it has a place to go that's going to slow it down before it actually hits the natural wetland terrain. It's used routinely overseas and is starting to increase in use in the USA. Overseas, Egypt being a big one, they actually use constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment. Wastewater treatment plants here in this part of the country discharge to, well, like the Leominster wastewater treatment plant, for example, discharges straight to the Nashua River. It does a very effective job in its wastewater treatment, and the plant's well run. But in Egypt, you don't have very many places you can discharge a wastewater treatment plant to in the desert. So what they do is they take this wastewater, they construct a wetland, and they make these wetland, what they call wetland cells. And they run wastewater through it and then run it back into the ground. And it works just like I believe the term that was used earlier was nature's septic tank. But this is constructed for that purpose. The United States is starting to use constructed wetlands for stormwater control. And many of you guys that are watching this video have probably seen neighborhoods that have been built in the last 30 years where you go by and you'll see this large hole in the ground right next to one of the houses. They call that a detention pond. All the storm water is routed through the detention pond. The water basically accumulates in there. It gives it a quiet place for the solids to settle. It gives it a quiet place to cool down because of the first injection of heat from the hot road from the sun. And then it slowly bleeds it out into the wetland. Those work good. They have their limitations. But what they've been finding is creating artificial stormwater-based wetlands like they do overseas actually is a more effective control, can be more effectively managed, and doesn't have as heavy of the maintenance issues as you do with a detention basin. So here's an overseas example from Germany of a constructed wetland behind a housing development. All of the water coming off of the roadway and surrounding properties wind up getting directed to this constructed wetland. Water percolates through the wetland, winds up making its way to a larger natural system and gets filtered out. So wetlands were built on purpose. So the question I have to ask you all is, if wetlands can be built on purpose and value your water and clean your water, I just wanted to ask the question. It begs the question, actually. If we're building it to clean water, can't we not see the value in leaving our natural ones alone and keeping them protected? So with that, it's time for everybody to wake up. Sorry I put everybody to sleep, but wake up now. I want to thank you all for listening to me. If you have any questions, my email address is on this slide. Feel free to email me anytime. Kelly, back to you.
Great.
Back to you.
Will's here too, so I'm gonna at least let him talk. Hi, Will. Will Snyder is our issue.
Will, how you doing?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks for doing this. I'm sorry I was my plans changed and I just got here for the last 20 minutes or so. But this is going to be a it's really nice to have a recording that introduces people to wetlands, because it really crosses all the environmental issues. It is not confined to one of our natural resource areas. It's a good place where we see them all come together. And actually, for the current issue, we have done it. We've done wetland conservation or wetland protection several times over the years. Had students look at the wetlands in their communities. So I can't say that I was here at the beginning, but I'm curious if you had any kind of global statements or information you would give to people, or suggestions to think about for wetlands and climate change, which is our water resources, and climate change is our current issue focus this year.
Well, I mean, I didn't touch on climate change when it came to wetland protection, but I think the benefit is pretty obvious. The more you protect the biodiversity, the more you protect the water quality, the more you wind up protecting the climate. And I can give you a very easy analogy. When you talk about ice melt, you talk about the ice melting at rapid rates. I actually just read a report, I believe it was in the New York Times, that spoke to, no, actually, I stand corrected. It was in yesterday's Wall Street Journal. And in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, they had an article about how ice has melted at the most rapid rate yet in recorded history. So what's happening is, one of the reasons why it's melting at such a rapid rate is because of the warming of the air, but also the ocean. And I had spoken about earlier in the talk about the effects of human habitation, which is the phrase word of the day, folks. For all you kids listening, human habitation is the word of the day. So roadways, I had spoken about, are the most environmentally intrusive aspect of any development for one particular reason. They elevate the temperature. Any of you watching this video, have you ever tried walking barefoot on your street in the summertime? What happens? You wind up dancing like on a hot bed of coals because it's that warm. Well, imagine having it be that warm. Imagine having a rainstorm came down and the first flush of water is heated from all of that pavement. But where does all that heated water go for a shot? It goes into your lakes and streams and then goes right through to the ocean, because that's where all, and I had alluded to earlier, that's where all your runoff goes. Now, it may not necessarily be as hot as it was when it first went in there, but when you think about it, the temperature has been elevated enough where it makes a difference. Where the water now going into the oceans is actually slightly warmer now than what it used to be. It's part of the reasons why your oceans are heating up. It's a combination of things that are heating up your ocean, but that plays a vital role in it. Keeping your wetlands protected actually helps to stabilize those temperatures because it gives the water a quiet place to still out and to cool down. And that makes a good barrier. Willie, I don't know if you were here earlier. I showed a picture of a large marsh over in Louisiana. In fact, if you want to indulge me, I'll just go back to it really quick. This freshwater swamp in Louisiana. In Louisiana and those sections down south, these large swamps are your last line of defense. They control flooding. Floodplains, by the way, are another thing we can get into someday. But they control flooding, they control temperature, and they maintain a biodiversity, and it's the last line of defense going to your ocean. And what I asked people viewing this video to imagine if this thing was gone and you had roadways in its place, and all that runoff was just making the beeline straight to the ocean. So I know I've gone the long-winded answer. I'm sorry, it's the Italian in me speaking right now, but that is my take on how protecting wetlands can help contribute to slowing climate change down. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it's so there's the two sides to addressing climate change. There's slowing it down, and then there's also protecting ourselves against the effects of climate change. And so you're making a case that wetlands can slow down the process of global warming, which is good news. I know that in that they do flood protection. They're also they play an important role in protecting from
rising sea levels,
but also inland here. If we have really more intense rainstorms, increased precipitation over the course of the year in general, it helps to hold that to hold the water in place as much as possible, to slow its flow down, so it doesn't erode and flood downstream.
Well, floodplain is a very important resource area. It is protectable under the Wetland Protection Act. And I had gone into what wetland replication or / reclamation was. And floodplain is essentially treated the same. You fill, you got to replace it on the same site. And the reason why floodplain is very important is for reasons that you touched on. It's holding the water back. It provides its value in protection. It provides the water a place to go and to settle. It slows runoff down. There are a myriad of values to having floodplain. So I
Okay.
think we touched on something that's very important to protect inland in the state of Massachusetts. For example, doing something more across the United States, we had those massive hurricanes that hit the state of Texas in 50 inches of rain. And a lot of the towns that were drowned out were carelessly built years ago on floodplains, to the point where they started receding those properties back. And it's bad enough that they were built in the floodplains, but that intense amount of rain amplified the effect of the floodplain alteration. The loss of property and the loss of life and the damage to the environment just from that hurricane, there's too much to list on this session.
Yeah.
So I thank you for that point.
So
Matt, I had a
so
couple
when
questions
teams-
for you.
Okay.
Yes, Cal.
Will, if you wanted to go on with your thought.
Well, I was just going to wrap it up to wrap up my piece of it, to say to teams that when you're thinking about water resources and climate change in your community, wetlands are a really key part of the landscape to look at and think about how we protect them and enhance them. That's me.
Perfect. Okay, Matt, I have a few questions I'm going to throw at you. I'll start with an easy one. Is a wetland always wet?
No. There are wetlands that are called intermittent wetlands. They will dry up in the summer. Their function is like a vernal pool. Vernal pool is as I use the other word in feral, meaning it's only in the spring. So they'll fill up with water and they'll show swampy properties in the spring. In the summer, they'll almost look like any other piece of upland, with the exception of you'll see the lower vegetation is more of a dead giveaway as to the fact that it is a wetland. And just because you can walk on it and it seems dry doesn't mean it has lost its value as a wetland. Some wetlands actually function deliberately under nature as an ephemeral wetland, a seasonal wetland. It does its function of providing an extended protection during the heavy part of the raining season in this area, but it still holds its value.
Okay, thank you. And I guess going off of that a little bit, what actually defines a wetland? Is it vegetation, or is it soils, or is it a combination?
It's actually a combination. Wetlands are very unique. They're very unique land features. For example, if you want to take like Lunenburg and Leominster, for example, they've got very similar properties when it comes to their wetlands. To identify a wetland overall, you hear the textbook definition of it takes vegetation, soils, and hydrology, meaning how does it hold or carry its water. That's what it means by hydrology. In Leominster and Lunenburg, there are a lot of wetlands that are based on the bottoms of steep slopes. So you don't have to worry about the soil properties on that wetland. You'll see it by its plant growth and by the way it carries water. Ashburnham. Ashburnham is an area where you've got areas in Ashburnham. Good luck trying to find hydric soils or wetland-based soils in some of those wetlands in Ashburnham. They carry the water very well through them. You can tell they're obviously wetlands, but they're mostly rock and hemlock. And hemlock is what's considered an obligate wetland plant by state law, although some biologists disagree with it. But you know, there are plenty of hemlock swamps that I've identified out in that part of central Massachusetts. So Ashburnham, parts of Templeton, parts of Petersham, The outskirts of the Quabbin Reservoir, like in Petersham, same thing like in Ashburnham, rock and hemlock. In those areas where it's not rocky, it's like a moss bog. So you'll have a heavy duty peat boggy area covered by a carpet of moss and a carpet of cinnamon fern on the side. And I believe I showed an example of cinnamon fern in the slide earlier. There you go. I actually delineated a wetland or identified a wetland in Petersham that was of that nature. It was absolutely gorgeous. It was like being in another world. But wetlands can be identified by all of those characteristics. But in order for it to be a wetland legally, it has to have 2 out of those 3 characteristics in the state of Massachusetts. You either have to find soils and hydrology, or vegetation and hydrology, or vegetation in soils and hydrology. You have to have at least 2 out of those 3.
Okay, thanks. Just a couple more. Sorry, I'm testing you here.
That's okay. Hey, Will. Will, meet Sal Amander. Vernal pool species.
Hey, Sal, I'd shake your hand, except you ain't got one.
Yeah, don't worry, she'll grow it back. Okay, Kelly, I'm sorry. Your next question?
You talked about building wetlands for stormwater control. You know, now
in Germany.
there's a big emphasis on building rain gardens that, you know, the normal homeowner can make look pretty and take care of themselves.
Mhm.
Once they're built, they essentially become their own small little wetland. Does that make them protected under the Wetlands Protection Act?
No. The reason being is there's a specific exemption in the law for a created wetland after a certain date. So anything that would be created now would be considered a drainage structure. Rain gardens are beautiful. I know a lot of people that will build a rain garden just because they love the way it looks. You can grow some very beautiful wetlands plants on them. They wind up taking care of a lot of different things, from runoff issues to flood control. They can grow rain gardens of all shapes and sizes. I know a gentleman in Lunenburg that grew one, lives right next to Hickory Hills Lake, grew one coming off the side of his driveway because he got sick of seeing the runoff go directly into the lake. So he grew one that was basically a linear shaped one, but it's beautiful. A lot of towns are giving development credits now if developers are replacing stormwater hardware with rain gardens. They're not the intensive constructed wetlands that you have here in this picture, but they function almost identically. There are provisions now where a lot of large developments are actually building, instead of those dry, round ponds that people see off the side of the roads, the detention basins, they're building wetland style detention basins or wet basins. The state is allowing some of those now, whereas they used to frown on them because of the way they were being constructed. A lot of developers weren't accounting for the groundwater sufficiently when they were trying to build them. So.
Great. So there's not a lot of paperwork once people put these in their yards that they have to go through to maintain them.
No, they don't wind up in what I like to call bogged down in bureaucracy. Some people would phrase it as, okay, great, now I'm subject to all these regulations. I got punished for actually protecting the environment. Well, no, the state puts in exemptions for those. And people that are subject to regulation, for example, that live on ponds, a lot of them will want to do things like plant, like decorative or wild looking vegetative shrubs where water flows to the lake. Even a small vegetative buffer that can look decent landscape winds up creating a level of protection to that adjacent water body. And you got a lot of people that are getting a lot more serious now about protecting their lakes and doing rain gardens on their own and doing all of these extra measures, what I call vegetative buffers, because they're beginning to realize things like maintaining the water quality and keeping that lake beautiful maintains their property value as well as the environment. So Some people do this because they relate it to their pocketbook. They realize that keeping their lake clean and keeping their wetland protected maintains their property.
Okay, great. And your the picture that you had shown of the invasive lily pads, to me, I look at that and I see that because of that surface cover, there's going to be a change in temperature in the chemistry of the pond. Is that a potential issue with overgrowth of lily pads?
Absolutely. The change in temperature and the change in the amount of sunlight that would normally get to certain depths of the water, it's going to change the microbial content in your water. It's basically an alteration of your water chemistry. And it starts at that level. It starts from being just a simple thing like overshading. Shading water is very important for temperature protection. A lot of that tends to apply more along the shorelines and the entrances to these waters. There are parts of the pond that need to be exposed to sunlight. So when you start covering this over with lily pads, you start making changes in that pond's dynamic at the chemical level that it didn't develop as. So it doesn't wind up being a pretty sight a lot of the time. That other pond example I gave you, Mosquito Pond, the reason why it was named Mosquito Pond was because the lily pads take over and it winds up being a mosquito breeding habitat. That's why they nicknamed it Mosquito Pond.
Okay. And I have just one more for you. This is kind of it might be an opinion kind of answer.
I'm an Italian. Do you really want me to vent my opinion? Do we have enough bandwidth for that?
And it's amazing that after 20 something years, you're still teaching me something. I never, working in the water field for, 26 years, I have never thought of the ocean as a big giant wetland. So thank you for that. But you know I'm a beach bunny. I love the ocean. It has a special place in my heart.
You love the ocean? I'm shocked to hear that, Kelly.
The big issue now seems to be microplastics in the ocean. Do you think that our wetlands and freshwaters are also being impacted?
Absolutely, 100%. Absolutely. I can give you a case I worked on actually in my own town, Leominster. Years ago, I was the Leominster Conservation Agent, Kelly, as you recall. And we used to have a company called Foster Grant. Foster Grant was famous especially for its brand of sunglasses back in the day, hence coining the phrase, who's that behind those Foster Grants? Well, Foster Grant did a lot of plastic extrusion work. And behind the Foster Grant plant, between that and going down by the back end of Doyle Field behind Pre-Street School, going all the way out to Route 13, there was a large swamp. In that large swamp, it was full of plastic extruder pellets to the point where it became a cleanup site. You couldn't walk through that thing without coming into contact with those plastic extruder pellets. So plastic extruder pellets obviously will cause major damage by just clogging up, changing the hydrology, degrading over a long period of time, and then not degrading in the short term, because plastic, as you know, takes years to develop. So essentially it takes years to degrade rather. So what you wind up having is a solid waste problem being thrown at you in inches, because you've got little pieces of solid waste basically all over your large wetland system. And that's not good. It will change the wetlands are very delicately balanced. You introduced an artificial structure like that serves no purpose other than to sit there and spill, and it causes a total change in the dynamic. And people don't realize even that little bit goes beyond, it goes beyond like 6-pack the plastic six-pack holders that you see pictures of, where you see the mammals like the ducks choking on it. These are the more silent ways that these can really hurt you, can really hurt nature. So yeah, plastic makes a huge difference. There's actually so much plastic in the ocean now that's been drifting around. In the other side of the world, there is actually an industry where people go out and their job is they run a business by grabbing plastic waste out of the ocean and bringing it to a recycling plant for money.
So the
That's been going on
save
for a while.
the save a straw, save a turtle images that we all see with the sea turtles should be changed to skip a straw, save a turtle with some of our inland turtle species then.
That's
Also-
correct. I mean, Kelly, if I could use an example of plastic that is a pet peeve of mine, that's been an ongoing debate around here that I see on social media for years, is the single-use plastic bags. I've seen so many people argue, well, what am I going to do with my cat litter if they get rid of the single-use plastic bags? Why do I have to use reusable bags? I've seen things that it just kind of makes me scratch my head because they're more concerned about what they're going to do with the cat litter because they don't have a single use plastic bag to put it out in. Single-use plastic bags and the amount that we use in this country clog up landfills. I remember going and patrolling the back watershed of Milltown Reservoir by the Rocky Pond area. And I would be like incensed because you would see, I remember going out, Leominster has a Ward 5 counselor, his name's Peter Angelini. I remember walking out one day with him because he was very much a volunteer activist. He was with the Conservation Commission. We were walking out in the Rocky Pond area and there were plastic single-use bags being blown in by the Fitchburg landfill. Out in the middle of that virgin woods because of the wind direction. And one thing I like to point out to people is that the largest exporter of these single-use plastic bags is China. And that's where we get our majority of our plastic single-use bags from. The country that is the largest exporter of single-use plastic bags bans them for use in their own country, because they're afraid of what the pollution from those bags will do. Now, this is China we're talking about. You know, we're talking coal-fired capital of the world, smog central. They have a disdain for single-use plastic bags because they're afraid of all things of the environmental effects. That's got to give you a real big message here, don't you think?
I agree. That was the last question I had for you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for doing this. I'm sorry it took so long.
Yes, we appreciate it. The Envirothon teams appreciate it. The steering committee appreciates it. And we're gonna have to get you involved more with the Envirothon. So I'll be calling you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.